Dawn breaks over the Elsenborn Ridge, not with a warm, comforting glow, but with a pale, bruised light struggling to pierce the canopy of shattered pine trees. For 72 hours, the Ardennes forest had been a meat grinder, a relentless hurricane of screaming artillery, the rhythmic tearing of machine gun fire, and the deafening roar of armored engines. Now there is only silence. It is a heavy, suffocating quiet, the kind of silence that rings in your ears and settles deep in your bones. The snow, which should be a pristine blanket of white, is heavily scarred. It is choked with black soot, churned by heavy steel treads and stained a deep, glacial, rusty red. The air is thick. It catches in the back of the throat. It is a sickening, unforgettable blend of vaporized diesel fuel, scorched pine resin, and the sharp, metallic stench of fresh blood turning to ice. Looming in the center of this ruined cathedral of wood and winter sits a monster, a German Panther tank. 45 tons of crop steel, engineered by the finest minds in Europe for the sole purpose of perfect, unyielding destruction. Its sloped armor was designed to bounce Allied shells like pebbles. Its long, menacing 75mm gun was meant to clear the path for a 1,000-year empire. But the monster is dead. Its right track is severed, unspooled in the bloody snow like the broken spine of a prehistoric beast. Thick, oily smoke curls lazily from a jagged, blackened crater just below its turret ring. And sitting casually on the very barrel of that fearsome gun is Private First Class Jimmy Hayes, 19 years old, a farmhand and tractor mechanic from just outside Des Moines, Iowa. He is not planting a flag. He is not cheering or raising his M1 Garand rifle to the sky in a triumphant victory pose. His olive-drab overcoat is stiff with frozen mud, the left shoulder torn and patched with a piece of dirty canvas. His face is smeared with grease and cordite. His hands, thick with grime and trembling slightly from a cold that bites straight to the bone, are moving with steady, deliberate patience. He holds a chipped, issued trench knife. He scrapes the blade against the heel of his soaked leather combat boot. A chunk of hardened, bloody ice falls away. He scrapes again, digging the packed soil out from the treads. He doesn't look like a conqueror who just broke the back of the most feared fighting force on Earth. He looks like a tired mechanic sitting on a fence post at the end of a very long, very bad shift. He breathes out a cloud of white vapor, mutters a quiet curse at the bitter wind biting his ears, and rubs his numb jaw. He would give just about anything in the world right now for a hot cup of black coffee. Down in the snow, half buried under the splintered trunk of a fallen pine, lies the reason the steel monster is dead. A German SS officer. He wears an immaculate tailored wool trench coat, though the fabric is now ruined and torn. Jimmy slides off the gun barrel. His boots hit the crust of the snow with a heavy crunch. He walks over, his legs stiff and aching, and nudges a piece of debris aside with his toe. Glinting sharply in the pale morning light is a piece of polished metal, an iron cross. Right next to it, resting in the slush, is a small, leather-bound notebook that must have slipped from the dead officer's tunic pocket. Jimmy bends down, his knees popping audibly in the biting air. He picks up the book. The leather is fine, expensive. It feels completely out of place in the mud. He thumbs the pages open with a dirty, numb thumb. The paper is thick, filled edge to edge with sharp, aggressive, cursive strokes. Black ink detailing grand, sweeping strategies, absolute victories, and the unbending, superior will of the Third Reich. Jimmy can't read a single word of German. To him, it's all just scribbles, noise on a page. He stares at it for a moment. The bottom edge of the notebook is soaked through with dark, dried blood, blurring the perfect, arrogant handwriting into a messy, illegible smear. Jimmy looks at the ruined book, then he looks down at the dead SS officer. Then he looks back up at the burning, smoking wreck of the invincible German war machine. He lets out a slow, tired sigh. 4 days earlier, December 15th, 1944, deep behind the German lines, inside the thick stone walls of a requisitioned Belgian estate, the war felt like a gentleman's rumor. A heavy oak log collapsed in the grand hearth, sending a shower of bright orange embers dancing up the stone chimney. The fire threw a rich, warm light across the room, catching the facets of a crystal decanter resting on a silver tray. In the corner, a gramophone softly played Wagner. The swelling, dramatic strings filled the heavy, stifling air of the study. SS Oberst Gruppenführer Sepp Dietrich stood with his back to the fire. He was a man who carried the brutal confidence of the Third Reich in the very set of his shoulders. His black leather boots were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the flickering flames. The silver oak leaves on his collar tabs gleamed. He held a delicate crystal glass of clear, high-proof schnapps, swirling the liquid with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Standing at rigid attention on the opposite side of a massive mahogany dining table was Major SS von Kessler. Von Kessler was younger, sharp-featured, his uniform immaculate, his eyes fixed, dead ahead. He was the tip of the spear, a frontline commander waiting for the word to let his armor slip the leash. Between them, spread across the polished wood, was the map. It was a pristine thing, unblemished by mud or blood. Neat red and blue arrows swept across the contour lines of the Ardennes forest in beautiful, sweeping arcs. To the men in this warm, fragrant room, the war was still an elegant game of chess. Dietrich took a slow, savoring sip of his drink. He set the glass down. He picked up a slender wooden baton and leaned over the table. The leather of his tailored uniform creaked in the quiet room. He rested the brass tip of the baton on a small, unassuming blue marker positioned right on the Elsenborn Ridge. "The American 99th Infantry Division," Dietrich murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He didn't say it with respect. He said it the way a man might identify a stain on a fine rug. "Intelligence tells us they are green," Dietrich continued, tapping the baton lightly against the map. Tap, tap. They call them battle babies, replacements, farm boys, grocery clerks. Mechanics who have never heard a shot fired in anger. Von Kessler remained stiff, his hands clasped behind his back. "They are holding the northern shoulder of our advance, Herr General." Dietrich scoffed, a harsh, barking sound that cut through the classical music. He walked around the table, his boots clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. He stopped right beside von Kessler, looking out the frost-covered window into the dark, freezing night. "Look at them, von Kessler. Look at the enemy they send us. They are children raised on jazz music and Coca-Cola. They are the soft, spoiled products of a weak democracy. They think war is a movie. They think they can simply buy their way to victory with assembly lines and rations." Dietrich turned back, his eyes narrowing, flashing with a fanatic, unyielding fire. They do not know what it means to suffer. They do not know what it means to bleed for soil, to fight with the absolute, unwavering will of a superior ideology. He brought the baton down hard on the table. The sharp crack made von Kessler blink. "You will lead the vanguard of the 12th SS Panzer Division," Dietrich commanded, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "The Hitlerjugend, our finest. Boys forged in absolute iron, who know nothing but the Führer's will." He leaned in close, so close von Kessler could smell the sharp alcohol on his breath. "You will hit them before the sun comes up. You will not trade fire with them from a distance. You will drive your panthers straight down their throats." Dietrich stood up straight, adjusting the cuffs of his tunic with meticulous care. "I do not want a battle, Major. I want a slaughter. I want you to hit them with such terrifying, overwhelming violence that their minds break before their bodies do. When they see our armor coming through the snow, when they hear the tracks, I want them to drop their weapons and run crying back to the coast." He picked down his glass and finished the schnapps in one swallow. "No prisoners, no delays. You will crush these children in 2 hours. Then the road to Antwerp is ours." Von Kessler clicked his heels together, delivering a crisp, sharp salute. "It will be done exactly as you command." Dietrich turned his back to the officer, staring into the roaring fire. He was absolutely certain of it. The map was perfect. The logic was flawless. The American spirit, he believed, was a fragile, hollow thing. It would shatter at the first true application of terror. He did not know, he could not possibly conceive, that out there in the freezing, pitch-black woods, a 19-year-old kid from Iowa was quietly loading a heavy brass N-block clip into an M1 rifle, getting ready to prove the entire Third Reich dead wrong. The cold in the Ardennes didn't just chill a man, it hunted him. It was a living, malicious thing that crept up through the soles of wet combat boots, crawled under the layers of issued wool, and settled deep into the marrow of the bones. In a shallow hole hacked out of the frozen Belgian mud, Private First Class Jimmy Hayes sat with his knees pulled tight to his chest. The water at the bottom of the foxhole had frozen solid around his boots hours ago. Next to him, hunched into a tight, miserable ball, was Private Tommy Miller. Tommy was barely 18, a kid from a Philadelphia brickyard who had lied about his age to enlist. Right now he was shivering so violently that the canteen on his hip rattled a steady, metallic rhythm against his entrenching tool. Tommy's face was the color of old parchment. He kept staring down at his boots. The toes of his left foot had stopped hurting yesterday. Now they were just numb, heavy blocks of wood. Frostbite. The quiet thief of the infantry. Jimmy reached into his breast pocket with agonizing slowness. His fingers were stiff, the joints cracking in protest. He pulled out a single crumpled Lucky Strike. It was slightly damp, bent in the middle. He struck a match, cupping the tiny, precious flame against the howling wind. He got the tobacco to catch, took a short drag and passed it to Tommy. Tommy took it with trembling hands, inhaling deeply. The glowing cherry illuminated the raw terror in the young boy's eyes. "I can't feel my feet, Jim," Tommy whispered, his teeth chattering. "I can't feel 'em at all. If the Krauts come, I ain't gonna be able to run." Jimmy took the cigarette back. He pinched a piece of loose tobacco from his bottom lip and looked out into the pitch-black void of the tree line. "Nobody's running, Tommy," Jimmy said, his voice a low, steady drawl. "You just stay put. Keep your head down." Jimmy looked at his own hands. The knuckles were cracked and bleeding, stained permanently black with rifle oil and dirt. Looking at those grease-stained hands didn't make him think of the war. It made him think of home. It took his mind exactly 4,000 miles away, straight back to an old, drafty wooden barn just outside Des Moines, Iowa. Winter of 1941. It had been cold then too, a brutal, sweeping prairie freeze, but that was a working cold, an honest cold. He remembered standing in the smell of dry hay and motor oil, his breath plumbing white in the air. In front of him sat a massive, seized-up John Deere tractor. The iron giant had thrown a rod, locking the whole engine up tight. Jimmy had been frustrated. He had thrown a heavy iron wrench across the barn, cursing the massive, unyielding hunk of metal. It was too big, too heavy. It couldn't be fixed. He remembered his father stepping out from the shadows of the barn. His father hadn't yelled. He had just walked over, picked up the wrench, and handed it back to Jimmy. "You're looking at the whole thing, Jim," his father had said, tapping a thick, calloused finger against the heavy iron engine block. "You're letting the size of it scare you. But it ain't a monster. It's just nuts, bolts, and gears." His dad had knelt down in the freezing dirt, pointing to a small hidden housing joint. "There ain't no machine built by man that can't be broken by man. I don't care how loud it is. I don't care how much smoke it blows. You find the weak spot, you apply the right leverage, and it will crack." Jimmy blinked, pulling his mind back to the frozen hell of the Ardennes. He rubbed his thumb over the cold steel receiver of his M1 Garand. Just nuts, bolts, and gears. The German tanks the officers kept whispering about. The invincible Panthers, the terrifying King Tigers. The weapons supposed to make the whole world tremble. Jimmy didn't see them as monsters from a nightmare. He saw them as machines, big, loud, heavily armored machines. And like his daddy said, every machine had a breaking point. You just had to be willing to stand close enough to find it. He took one last drag of the cigarette and stubbed it out on the frost-hardened dirt wall of the foxhole. At exactly 5:30 in the morning, the sky tore open. It didn't start with a single boom. It started with a sound like the fabric of the universe ripping apart. The horizon behind the German tree line flashed a blinding, hellish orange. A split second later, the ground heaved. It felt like the earth itself was being lifted up and dropped. Artillery shells, 100 of them, screaming like freight trains, slammed into the American lines. The air instantly filled with flying mud, jagged steel shrapnel, and the splintered shards of exploding pine trees. The concussions were physical blows to the chest. The noise was so absolute, so overwhelming, that it pushed past hearing and became pure, agonizing pressure inside the skull. Tommy screamed. The young boy from Philadelphia completely shattered. The noise and the sheer, overwhelming violence broke whatever fragile thread was holding him together. He dropped his rifle. He scrambled up the muddy wall of the foxhole, clawing wildly at the snow, trying to get out, trying to run away from the apocalypse. Running out of a hole during an artillery barrage was a guaranteed death sentence. Jimmy lunged. He grabbed Tommy by the heavy webbing of his harness. With a surge of desperate, farm-built strength, Jimmy yanked the terrified boy backward. They crashed into the freezing water at the bottom of the hole. Tommy thrashed wildly, fighting like a drowning man, screaming something lost in the deafening thunder of exploding shells. Jimmy pinned the boy down. He shoved his face inches from Tommy's, his hands gripping the boy's shoulders like iron visors. He didn't yell about the flag. He didn't yell about democracy. He didn't tell him to be a hero. "Look at me!" Jimmy roared over the deafening explosions. "Look at me, Tommy." Tommy's eyes were wide, panicked, searching Jimmy's face. "We are going to do our job," Jimmy shouted, his voice steady, immovable anchor in the middle of a hurricane. "We're going to do our job. We're going to break their damned machines, and then we are going home. You hear me? We're going home." Tommy stopped thrashing. He was still shaking, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his cheeks, but he nodded, a small, jerky nod. Jimmy let go of the boy's harness. He grabbed Tommy's fallen rifle out of the mud, wiped the bolt clean with his sleeve, and shoved it hard into the kid's hands. Then Jimmy Hayes turned around. He leaned his elbows on the frozen dirt lip of the foxhole, raised his own rifle, and stared straight into the dark, burning tree line, waiting for the monsters to show themselves. Major SS von Kessler stood waist-deep in the commander's cupola of his Panther tank. Through the thick, armored glass of the periscope, the world was framed in narrow, violent rectangles. Beneath his boots, the massive Maybach V12 engine growled, a vibration that rattled his teeth. Behind him rolled a steel armada, a tidal wave of the Third Reich's finest armor and infantry, cutting through the frozen woods like a scythe. The artillery had stopped. Now it was time for the slaughter. Von Kessler gripped the edge of the hatch. He waited for the sight General Dietrich had promised. He waited to see the olive-drab uniforms breaking from the tree line. He waited to see the American boys throwing down their weapons, weeping, running blind in terror from the mechanical beasts of the SS. He saw nothing. The snow was scarred with craters, smoking and black, but there was no movement. Von Kessler frowned. He grabbed his throat microphone to order the infantry forward. Then the snowbanks simply erupted. The children hadn't run, they had dug deeper. From invisible holes hacked into the frozen earth, a blinding, overlapping sheet of .30 caliber tracer fire lashed out, slamming into the advancing German grenadiers. It wasn't the wild, panicked spraying of untrained rookies. It was disciplined. It was terrifyingly accurate. Von Kessler watched, his jaw tightening, as the invincible SS infantry, men who had burned their way across Europe, were cut down like wheat in the snow. He ordered his tank forward to crush the resistance. As the Panther lurched over a berm, von Kessler saw a solitary American soldier through the vision slit. The boy was alone in a ruined crater, his helmet gone, his uniform in rags. 2 SS grenadiers charged the hole, submachine guns raised. The American raised his rifle. He pulled the trigger. A dull click, jammed with ice. Von Kessler expected the boy to surrender, to raise his hands and beg for mercy. That was what the propaganda films said they would do. Instead, the American let the rifle drop. He reached to his belt, ripped a folding steel entrenching shovel from its canvas sheath, and launched himself directly at the 2 heavily armed Germans with the pure primal savagery of a cornered wolf. Von Kessler physically recoiled from the periscope. A cold spike of dread drove itself right through his chest. They aren't running. Suddenly, a strange, high-pitched, shrieking sound filled the air above the battlefield. It wasn't the whistling of a single incoming shell. It sounded like the sky itself was tearing in half. Von Kessler's eyes went wide. He knew that sound. Every veteran on the Eastern Front knew that sound. Time on target. The American artillery commanders, miles away, had synchronized their fire. Every gun, every howitzer, firing at different trajectories, timed perfectly so that every single shell would impact at the exact same fraction of a second. But as von Kessler looked at the coordinates of the incoming barrage, his blood ran freezing cold. The Americans weren't targeting the German rear. They were dropping the steel rain directly onto their own front line. They are calling artillery on their own heads. Von Kessler ducked down into the turret, pulling the heavy steel hatch shut, just as the world outside ceased to exist in a blinding flash of white light and unimaginable violence. Sitting in the dark, suffocating steel box, listening to the shrapnel ring against the armor like hail, the Major's fanaticism finally broke. These soft, spoiled boys of democracy wouldn't give up a single inch of dirt. They would rather drag the entire SS into hell with them. 50 yards away, buried under a collapsed wall of snow and dirt, Jimmy Hayes couldn't hear the artillery. He couldn't hear anything. The concussions had ruptured his left eardrum. Warm blood trickled down his neck, freezing as it hit his collar. His hands moved entirely on their own. The heavy wood of the M1 Garand was blisteringly hot against his bare palm. His thumb was bruised purple from slamming clip after clip into the hungry receiver. Aim, squeeze, recoil. The sharp, metallic ping of the empty clip ejecting, slam another in. He didn't look at the faces of the men in the grey uniforms he was shooting. He didn't care about their ideology. He didn't care about the swastikas on their helmets. He was just a mechanic, and they were the pests trying to ruin the harvest. He shifted his weight in the muddy hole, and his knee bumped into Tommy. Tommy wasn't shooting anymore. The kid from Philadelphia was slumped against the dirt wall. His face was ash white. A jagged piece of shrapnel from a tree burst had torn through his thigh. A dark, heavy stain was spreading fast, melting the snow beneath him. Jimmy dropped his rifle. He didn't panic. He didn't scream for a medic who would never come. He moved with the same methodical, blue-collar focus he used to patch a blown tire on a muddy tractor. He ripped the canvas strap off Tommy's webbing. He wrapped it high around the boy's bleeding thigh, grabbed a sturdy piece of pine branch and twisted it hard, creating a crude, brutal tourniquet. Tommy let out a weak, breathless gasp. His hands grabbed weakly at Jimmy's coat. "Jim," Tommy whispered, his eyes rolling back. "It hurts." "I'm cold. I know it hurts, kid," Jimmy said, his voice a harsh rasp. He pulled his own filthy wool scarf from his neck and pressed it over the wound. "You just keep breathing. You owe me a beer in Philly, remember?" Dirt rained down on them as a German tank shell slammed into the trees above. Jimmy looked up over the edge of the hole. Through the thick, choking smoke, he saw the grey silhouettes moving closer. They were shouting, firing blindly into the craters. They were 50 feet away, then 40. Jimmy didn't think about the president. He didn't think about the Star-Spangled Banner or the Grand Crusade to save Europe. He looked down at Tommy, who was bleeding out in the icy mud. He felt a deep, slow-burning fire ignite in his chest. A fierce, protective rage. This was his foxhole. This was his brother, and nobody was going to cross that line. Jimmy picked his M1 Garand back up. He wiped the dirt from the rear sight with a bloody thumb. He rested the barrel on the frozen dirt, took a slow, steady breath of cordite-laced air, and leveled the sights directly at the chest of the first advancing German. He didn't shout a battle cry. He just went back to work. Late afternoon, December 18, 1944. The grand stone chateau, once a sanctuary of warmth and aristocratic confidence, now felt like a tomb. The fire in the hearth had burned down to smouldering grey ash. The sweeping Wagner symphony had been turned off hours ago. In its place was a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. It sounded like a judge's gavel coming down, over and over again. General Sepp Dietrich stood by the frosted window, his hands clasped tight behind his back. The mirror shine on his leather boots was gone, scuffed by his relentless pacing across the hardwood floor. He stared out at the fading light. He checked his gold pocket watch for the 20th time in an hour. They were behind schedule, terribly, impossibly behind schedule. The radio operators in the adjoining room had stopped relaying crisp, victorious coordinates. Now, the receivers only spit out frantic bursts of static, panicked demands for reinforcements, and the horrifying, undeniable sounds of German units being annihilated. The heavy oak doors of the study groaned open. Dietrich turned, his face a mask of barely contained fury, ready to lash out at whatever adjutant dared to interrupt him. He froze. Standing in the doorway was Major von Kessler. The major did not march in. He did not click his heels or raise his arm in a crisp salute. He leaned heavily against the thick wooden doorframe, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. He looked like a ghost, dragged backward through hell. His immaculate, tailored SS trench coat was shredded into filthy rags, scorched black and stiff with frozen mud. His face was hollow, eyes sunken and ringed with soot. A crude, bloody bandage was wrapped haphazardly around his left hand. He didn't smell of fine cologne or leather anymore. He brought the stench of the Ardennes into the room with him, the sickening, metallic odor of burnt diesel, vaporized steel, and fallen men. Dietrich stared at his vanguard commander, his mind refusing to process the image. "Major," Dietrich barked, his voice tight, attempting to project an authority that was rapidly evaporating. "Why are you here? Why are my Panthers not moving through the Elsenborn Ridge?" Von Kessler slowly looked up. His eyes were completely vacant, The fanatic fire that had burned in them just 3 days ago was utterly extinguished. "The ridge is held, Herr General," von Kessler whispered. His voice was hoarse, destroyed by the cold and the smoke. "We cannot pass." Dietrich took a menacing step forward, his hand dropping to the riding crop on the table. "Cannot pass? What do you mean, cannot pass? You have the heaviest armor in the world. You are facing children. Where is the Hitlerjugend? Where are my elite grenadiers?" Von Kessler swallowed hard. He looked at the crystal decanter of schnapps on the silver tray, but he didn't move toward it. "They are dead, General." The words hung in the air heavy and absolute. "They are dead," von Kessler repeated, a hollow rhythm to his voice. "Our tanks, our invincible machines, they are trapped. They cannot maneuver because the roads are choked with the burning wreckage of our own armor. We cannot advance because the snow is piled high with the bodies of our own infantry." Dietrich's face flushed a deep, violent purple. He snatched a delicate crystal glass from the table, gripping it tight in his fist as a physical anchor against the rising tide of panic. "This is impossible," Dietrich roared, spit flying from his lips. "They are green replacements. Soft, democratic cowards. They should have broken at the first sight of our steel. Why are they not running?" Von Kessler finally stood up straight. He looked the most feared general of the SS directly in the eyes. "Because we misread them." Von Kessler closed his eyes for a second, seeing the flashes of the artillery, seeing the ragged boy launching himself out of a hole with a folding shovel. They do not fight like a military general. They fight like cornered animals. When their weapons freeze, they use their hands. When they run out of ammunition, they call our artillery down on their own heads, just to take us to the grave with them. They do not care about our ideology. They do not fear our uniforms. Von Kessler let out a trembling, bitter breath. "We brought a machine to crush soldiers. But out there in the snow, those are not soldiers. Those are boys who have simply decided that they are not going to let the man next to them die. You cannot break a spirit that does not care about your superiority." Dietrich stood frozen. The words hit him harder than any physical blow, his grand strategy. The absolute unbending doctrine of the 1,000-year Reich, the myth of Aryan invincibility. It was all bleeding to death in the frozen mud, stopped cold by the stubbornness of mechanics, farmers, and grocery clerks. The realization was too vast, too humiliating. Dietrich's knuckles turned bone white. The pressure in his mind transferred directly to his hand. Crack. The delicate crystal glass shattered in Dietrich's fist. The sharp, sudden noise echoed violently in the quiet room. Jagged shards of glass bit deep into the general's palm. Dietrich slowly opened his hand. He didn't make a sound. He just stared down in blank, suffocating horror as the mixture of premium schnapps and dark, red blood dripped slowly from his fingers, pooling on the immaculate, pristine map of the Elsenborn Ridge. A single drop of dark liquid fell, hitting the packed snow with a soft hiss. It was not blood. It was scalding black coffee. Morning had fully broken over the Elsenborn Ridge. December 19, 1944. Private First Class Jimmy Hayes sat on the steel tracks of the ruined Panther tank, holding a battered aluminum canteen cup in both hands. The metal was blackened from being heated over a smokeless heat tab, dented from a dozen drops, and so hot it nearly blistered his palms. To Jimmy it felt like holding a piece of heaven. He took a slow, careful sip. It tasted like mud, tin, and burnt grounds. It was the best thing he had ever drank in his entire life. The battlefield around him was completely still. The American line had held. The invincible 12th SS Panzer Division had broken itself against a wall of teenage farm boys, leaving their burning machines and their dead behind in the snow. Jimmy set the tin cup down on the cold steel of the tank tread. He reached into the pocket of his heavy wool coat and pulled out the piece of silver he had found in the snow earlier, the Iron Cross. He turned it over in his rough, calloused fingers. In the warm, quiet studies of Berlin, men like General Sepp Dietrich believed that symbols like this could conquer the world. They believed this little piece of stamped metal represented a master race, an unbreakable will, a destiny of total domination. They had burned Europe to the ground for the right to wear it. Jimmy rubbed his thumb over the blackened silver. To him it had no weight, it had no magic. It couldn't patch a hole in a canvas tent. It couldn't fix a seized engine block. It couldn't even buy a hot meal in Des Moines. It was just a piece of useless scrap. With a slight flick of his wrist, Jimmy tossed the medal away. It tumbled through the freezing air and landed with a dull, heavy thud in a muddy, water-filled crater, sinking instantly out of sight. Jimmy didn't watch it fall. He had already moved on. He reached into his breast pocket, close to his chest where it had stayed dry, and pulled out a crumpled, folded piece of paper and a dull stub of a pencil. He flattened the paper against his thigh. He licked the tip of the pencil, leaving a dark smudge of graphite on his tongue. He didn't write about the screaming artillery. He didn't write about the terrifying silhouette of the German tanks. He didn't write about the fanatical SS troops, or the fact that his division had just saved the northern flank of the entire Allied line. He pressed the pencil to the paper, his handwriting slow and deliberate. "Dear Ma and Pa, I am doing fine. The weather here is a little rough, plenty of snow, but I am keeping my socks dry when I can. Do not worry about what you hear on the radio. The Krauts make a lot of noise, but they aren't so tough once you look them in the eye. Tell Pa I will send my next pay envelope straight home. We need to get that south roof on the barn patched before the spring rains come. I know the old timber is rotting out. Tommy is okay. He got a piece of scrap iron in his leg, but the medics put him on a truck this morning. He was complaining the whole time, which means he is fine. He is going to a hospital with real beds and hot food. Lucky bum. I miss you both. Keep the stove warm. I will be home to help with the harvest. Love, Jimmy." He blew on the paper to dry the graphite, folded it carefully along the worn creases, and tucked it safely back into his pocket. He picked up his coffee, finishing the last cold, bitter drops. Jimmy Hayes stood up. His back ached, his joints popped. He picked up his heavy M1 Garand, the woodstock battered and scarred, and slung it over his shoulder. He took one last look at the ruined German war machine beneath his feet, adjusted the chin strap on his helmet, and started walking back toward the American lines to see who needed help digging the next foxhole. They did not march into war out of a desire for glory. They did not fight to conquer foreign lands or to prove their blood was superior to anyone else's. They were simply ordinary men, mechanics, farmers, grocers, high school kids who loved baseball and drive-in movies. When the darkest evil the world had ever known threatened to consume the earth, they did not waver. They crossed oceans, walked into freezing hellscapes, and looked the devil square in the face. They broke the back of tyranny not with fanaticism, but with quiet, unbreakable resolve. And when the terrible job was finally done, they didn't ask for crowns or thrones. They just put their hands in their pockets, picked up their tools, and quietly went back to building the greatest nation on earth.